My slides later with everybody. Number 3, I want to say what Dr. Rodenberg said, which is there's no student questions. Please feel free to ask any and all questions, and especially once I get really excited, I start talking really quickly, and you may want me to slow down. So just interrupt me to say, Beth, please explain to us. And then lastly, of course, is yes, I wish I were there, and I hope I can be there some other time. Feel free to contact me with my email, and I'd be happy to discuss any or all of this some other time. So, I'm going to talk about midstream circadian rhythms in humans. And what I did is, we just finished this major review article that I sent last week to the organizers, and I don't know if it's been sent to you guys also, but I'm going to go through some of what's in there and some other things. So, let's move on. I have conflicts of interest that I need to report, but none of these are related to what I'm going to talk about. And I learned this from one of my mentors, that when you're giving a talk, think out loud, which hopefully we're going to do. We're going to stick to the basics and of course be kind. So I'm going to talk about why measure circadian rhythms in humans. I think it's sort of obvious that you're interested in, well, some of you are interested in that. But let's talk about why we're going to do it and what we would do with the data. How do we measure circadian rhythms in humans? And analyses of circadian rhythms. Subtract the two, this isn't a line. It isn't a constant difference between sleep and wake temperatures at any particular circadian phase. And therefore you can't what's called demask. You can't just say, oh, they fell asleep, I'm going to change the temperature by 0.2 degrees to figure out circadian phase, because you can see the difference can be between 0.2 degrees and 0.4 degrees. And therefore you could possibly, or probably, come up with the wrong answer. I want to look at this kind of relationship, that there's a difference in sleep or wake effects also occurs for activity levels, such as from vacuum. So, let me be a little more explicit. Why do we need to know this? Well, if we're going to treat a circadian disorder, or using circadian principles, we need to know the time of circadian system, because that's different from unevoked effects. It's relatively easy to change the time of eating or the time of waking and sleeping or light levels, but if we're targeting the circadian system, we need to know the underlying physiology, the diagnosis, intervention, monitoring, and research. So, as I've already mentioned, there's this nonlinear interaction. And so, if we want to time it, I'm hoping I will have convinced you that we don't time it necessarily, if we're trying to do something that's sleep-wake, primarily sleep-wake, we could time the intervention relative to sleep and wake, and all the behaviors that are associated with sleep and wake. So when you're asleep or you're awake, alone, you have changes in light levels, you have changes in posture, you have changes in social interactions, you have changes in eating and fasting. There are all these things that happen, but if we want to do circadian phase, we need to know circadian phase. So let's go back to, this is the idea about what time are we talking about. So for diurnal rhythms, we can actually be talking about multiple different times even. So there's the local social clock time, like on the watch of the computer, so that you knew when to show up for the talk today. There's sun time, which is what time the sun is up or it's down. There's time relative to a behavior. So what happens, did something happen relative to when they woke up? Or did something happen relative to clock time? Or did something happen relative to sun time? Or is something happening related to circadian time? And for the marker of circadian time, I'm going to talk about the dim light melatonin onset DIL mode. And I'm going to discuss that in detail later. I'm just asking you to trust me right now that when I talk about the DIL mode, I'm talking about a marker of circadian phase, and I'll try to remember to say that every time. So, let's think about time. So, and are they interchangeable? And this is the idea that they're not. So we know that social clock time, the time on your watch or the time you show up at a lecture, is not the same thing as circadian clock time. I already showed you an example of somebody who's blind, and their circadian phases change at different circadian clock times. But even for people who aren't blind, there's a range of DIL mode. There's a range of circadian timing for people within the same time zone. So we did this study about college students at a single college, actually, in the greater Boston area. And we looked at these students, and over 222 students, their circadian timing crossed 11.5 hours. So even if you're in the same time zone, you cannot assume that somebody has the same internal circadian time. We also know that seasonality affects, it means that the relationship of a particular circadian marker may change because the timing in which the light and dark changes. So from right now, during the winter, there's many few hours of sunlight and many more hours of darkness. And in this particular study, that meant that people's melatonin started rising as a marker, one marker of circadian phase, started rising at a much earlier clock time than they did during summer. So the seasonality or the light exposure may affect your circadian marker, and therefore that's another example why clock time does not necessarily give you circadian time. Another example of using as an extension of this idea of clock time versus circadian time, because that study of college students had a very wide range of circadian time, we can examine the effects of timing of eating using the social clock and the circadian clock timing as a reference to see if the timing of eating affected body composition, or in other words, whether or not students were lean or non-lean, for example, obese. So for this particular study, once again, DOMO is a marker of circadian phase, and it's a marker of when melatonin starts to rise. And if we look at the time of eating relative to DOMO, in other words, do they eat earlier, the dark line, which is lean people, or do they eat later, which is the non-lean people? So it turns out, I'm sorry, I should have said the other way around. The lean people eat earlier, they have a percentage of calories that are earlier relative to DOMO than the non-lean people, who ate their calories later relative to their circadian pacemaker. So here, if we use the circadian pacemaker, we can say that the timing of eating is different in those people who are lean versus non-lean. And then we can decide, oh, there's a circadian difference. Can we change, as an example, can we change the timing that people eat and maybe move them from being non-lean to lean? Is this one way of helping people lose weight? However, when we took those same data and referenced them to social clock time, we saw no difference. So if we had only analyzed the data relative to social clock times, we might not have seen that there may be a circadian influence on timing of eating and its relationship to whether somebody is lean or not lean, or at least these college students. The second relationship is the relationship between social clock time and sun clock time. I already gave you one example from seasonality. Here's another example from time zones, and time zones which are in social time zones imposed by the individual countries and the actual sun time. So if we look at actual sun time by longitude, that's the background color: pink, yellow, light green, light blue, or purple. If we look at the time zone for each country, you can see that some countries have chosen to be in quote-unquote the right time zone for the light levels. But some are in the wrong time zone. For example, France and Spain, but not Portugal, are in the wrong time zone for given the light levels. And this is Iceland, I believe. Iceland is also in the wrong time zone. And it gets even worse when you're in daylight saving time. Because daylight saving time is like moving the clock time one time zone to the east without moving the sun time. So, can we use bedtime as a marker of circadian time? And so in order to do that, you would have to assume that the phase relationship, or the timing between circadian clock time and bedtime, is constant. And I've already, well, I'm about to tell you that's not constant in a whole group of people. It's not constant in early versus late sleepers, the people who choose the timing of their sleep to be at different times. It's not the same in chronotypes, those morning larks and evening owls that Dr. Rodenberg talked about. Your life is complicated. So let's talk about how do we measure circadian rhythms in humans. Now that I've said you can't necessarily use as your reference sun time, clock time, or bedtime, how do we measure it? And this is where life gets difficult, or interesting, or forward. So there's specific protocols, and you also have to choose your marker appropriately. So let's talk about specific protocols. There are two major determinants of physiologic function related to sleep and circadian rhythms. I've already mentioned them without putting them in the framework of what's called the two-process model. So the two-process model, which was originally published by Lorde, is highly influential, and it formalizes this idea that if you're looking at something, some aspect of physiology, whether it's your alertness, or your hunger, or your core body temperature, it depends on your biological time of day and sleep-wake, how long you've been awake, or how long you've been asleep, or even whether you're awake or you're asleep. And sleep-wake homeostasis can be thought of consecutive waking hours, how long have you been awake, and that includes sleep inertia, which is this groggy feeling you have the first couple minutes after you wake up that does not necessarily require coffee to wake up, but it takes around an hour to fully dissipate. And it's because all of your brain does not necessarily wake up at the same time. Some parts of your brain take a little longer. You can also think of sleep-wake homeostasis as being long-term, the sleep deprivation you accumulate over a work week, and then you can release on a free day or on vacation. And then once again, there's a nonlinear interaction of these with the with circadian rhythms. So you're going to learn a lot more about the circadian pacemaker and the nucleus. I believe Dr. Herzog is talking about the actual physiology. From a human circadian point of view, the SCN and the hypothalamus influences multiple daily rhythms. When we feel sleepy and when we feel alert, our actual sleep and wake times, core body temperature, hormones, performance, digestive functions, and it's entrained by non-visual light stimuli, receptors and pathways in the rest. That's a whole other talk. I'm just giving you an introduction. So I hopefully have explained to you why we need to separate circadian and homeostatic effects. Sleep-wake homeostasis affects sleep and wake state. They're affected with multiple other changes in behaviors that will affect the variable that you're looking at. And on a 24-hour day, however, the length of time you're awake or asleep co-varies with circadian days. So even if all of us had the same circadian days, most people without a circadian sleep-wake disorder would always be asleep at certain circadian days or awake at certain circadian days. And therefore you use protocols in order to separate circadian rhythms from sleep-wake homeostasis. And if I were there and we had more time, I would have you design the next two protocols. It's great fun to have you think about how you would actually design a protocol to study the effects of circadian rhythms and sleep-wake homeostasis. However, I'm here and you're there, and we don't have a lot of time. So the two protocols I'm going to talk about are constant routine, which will include some sleep deprivation, and vortice synchrony protocols. And for both of these, the circadian phase markers we're going to use will be core body temperature and melatonin. So let's talk about the constant routine. So the constant routine conditions are in constant conditions. So continuous wake, we're usually around 40 hours, in a semi-recumbent position, so you don't change the posture, with frequent small meals, usually give them around once an hour, so there are not large meals that might affect all sorts of things, in low light. And actually, the technician who's working with the participants, there's always somebody with them, so there's no change in social interactions. And on top of that, the technicians are instructed not to discuss anything that might influence somebody's behavior. That usually means politics, but it could mean playing a chess game, because we've seen people change their alertness and their mood depending on how a chess game is played. So let's give an example of here where people are under entrained or a 24-hour light dark cycle, or they're under a constant routine. And here are all the variables that we can measure, that we measure here. So here, these gray dots are when somebody would usually be asleep, and they actually were asleep because they were under entrained conditions with wake, sleep, and wake. And here it's just wake, and they continue being awake because they're in a constant routine and they're awake. So we can see for some things that core body temperature for some things being asleep makes a big change. So there's a big dip in core body temperature that's greater than if you're awake. There's a dip in urine volume that's greater than you're awake, so you don't have to get up in the middle of the night to pee. And we can also see there's a greater effect on parathyroid hormone than there is under the constant routine conditions. For some things, actually sleep and wake suppress it. You can see when somebody goes to sleep, there's a little bit of suppression in growth hormone, and when they wake up, there's a little bit of a bump. And for TSH, you can also see that thyroid-stimulating hormone also is suppressed by sleep and wake, because it's higher here all the time. Oh, and I forgot, I'm sorry. And for some things, there's actually an increase by sleep. And you can see, at least for young men, there's a big pulse of growth hormone when they first fall asleep. And it actually, if you look at sleep episodes, little times of wake within a sleep episode, you can also sometimes see pulses of growth hormone, or growth hormone. Or, I'm sorry, sometimes you can see pulses of cortisol, not growth hormone. And prolactin is also increased under sleep versus continuous sleep. So, and then of course activity changes. So the big question is there anything that doesn't seem to be affected by sleep and wake if you're under dim light conditions and in the same posture, and that's melatonin. Now, melatonin is affected by light levels, and so that's why we do the dim light melatonin onset. It's also slightly affected by posture, and so when samples are collected for doing the dim light melatonin onset, participants are instructed to be in the same posture for a while before using it. But this melatonin, at least, does not seem to be affected by sleep or wake, or by eating primarily, and so we usually use it as a circadian marker, because as long as somebody's in dim light, they don't need to do a constant routine. So here's an example of someone used a constant routine to compare the effects of sleep deprivation and alcohol on somebody's performance. So for this test, all somebody had to do was push a button whenever something happened, changed on the computer screen. And you can see that if one is the relative performance during the day, they do pretty well. This is the levels that they did when people had blood alcohol level of 0.05, which is illegal in the United States, or 0.08. And these were the values that people had when they had blood alcohol level 0.05, 0.08. And this is what happened on the constant routine if you kept somebody awake. So after being awake for approximately 18 hours, people started just pushing a button, like the equivalent of slamming on the brakes when something changes in front of you, as if they were legally drunk. And it persisted throughout the circadian night. Versus, and then it got even worse in the middle of the night, after around 24 hours. And then you also notice, however, that the circadian system started waking them up again at the end of the night. So it's not just that it gets worse across the night, the circadian system starts waking them up. And just to point out, there are 100,000 crashes a year in drivers and drivers in the United States. And while there's an organization, again, called Mothers Against Drunk Driving, there is not a Mothers Against Drowsy Driving, so we would love to have such an organization on our side. Of course, we would prefer that there weren't drowsy driving accidents in the first place. The second protocol is called the forced desynchrony protocol. And the forced desynchrony protocol takes even longer than those 40 hours I just mentioned, usually. So what we do is we impose a desynchrony, we desynchronize, we separate the sleep-wake schedule, which is called the T-cycle, and the output of the circadian system. And therefore we can distribute sleep and wake entirely, evenly over the circadian cycle. And the T-cycle periods have been everything from 90 minutes, or 1.5 hours, to 42.85 hours. If you do a 90-minute, quote-unquote, day, T-cycle, you can get many things not necessarily related to sleep, but you can still look at time of day effects on alertness and performance and some hormones, but you won't necessarily learn anything about sleep because people are only allowed to sleep for 30 minutes, and many things take sleep processes, some sleep processes take more than 30 minutes to happen. So, here's a raster plot. I'm going to go over the raster plot one more time, in case some of you don't know what it is. So for a raster plot, and for those of us who are old enough, remember how it was originally derived, where there used to be, it's originally derived from, there used to be animals on running wheels. Then the running wheel had a pen, and there was this piece of paper that went continuously, and every time the running wheel went up and down, the pen would go up and down, so you could see when the animal was active. Or you could have a pen associated with whenever an animal ate, And so there would be this long strip of paper, and it would have markings when something happened at time. And the graduate student, myself or others, I'm sure on this call, used to have to cut it at 24-hour intervals and paste it on this board. And so you can see what happens here is that for this particular study, here's one 24-hour, here's the next 24-hour, here's the next 24 hours, here's the next 24 hours. In this case, however, what we're marking is in these open bars, when somebody was scheduled to be asleep, in these very open columns when the constant routine occurred, and in these black dots when wake occurred within the sleep episode. And I'll get back to that in a minute. And then these gray barriers are when core body temperature is low. So what we then do usually is what's called double plot it, so that it's easier to see what happens across this midnight boundary. And so this is the same as this. This is the same as this, because I've now plotted it here, and again here, and here, and again here, but now we can more easily see what's happening. And we can see that core body temperature has a non-24, but not a 28-hour day, because these people were put on a 28-hour per day. So we can see that we put people on a 28-hour day, but we can also see that the amount of weight within a sleep episode appears to depend on how long they've been in the sleep episode, because it tends to happen at the end of the sleep episode. But it only occurs at some circadian basis. It only occurs here, and it doesn't occur at these circadian bases. So here's an example of, if we look at reaction time tests, if we look at melatonin, if we look at core body temperature, if we look at it relative to circadian phase, you can see that there's a circadian rhythm, core body temperature from a forced synchrony protocol, from melatonin, and in your reaction. But we can also see that depending, if we also look at it based on a T cycle, we can see that there's a sleep-wake effect on core body temperature. There's very little effect on melatonin. And there's a sleep-wake effect on your reaction time. The longer you're awake, the slower you are. And now, as I keep on saying, there are these non-linear interactions. So if we look again at that amount of weight within a sleep episode that I showed you 2 slides beforehand, we can see that there's a circadian rhythm. We can see that there's a sleep-dependent rhythm, such that there's more at the end of the sleep episode. And there's a little bit of weight at the beginning, because sometimes people take a few minutes to fall asleep. But then we plotted on a 3D graph, we can see that there's a non-linear interaction. But it only occurs at some circadian basis. It only occurs here, and it doesn't occur at these circadian bases. So here's an example of, if we look at reaction time tests, if we look at melatonin, if we look at core body temperature, if we look at it relative to circadian phase, you can see that there's a circadian rhythm, core body temperature from a forced synchrony protocol, from melatonin, and in your reaction. But we can also see that depending, if we also look at it based on a T cycle, we can see that there's a sleep-wake effect on core body temperature. There's very little effect on melatonin. And there's a sleep-wake effect on your reaction time. The longer you're awake, the slower you are. And now, as I keep on saying, there are these non-linear interactions. So if we look again at that amount of weight within a sleep episode that I showed you 2 slides beforehand, we can see that there's a circadian rhythm. We can see that there's a sleep-dependent rhythm, such that there's more at the end of the sleep episode. And there's a little bit of weight at the beginning, because sometimes people take a few minutes to fall asleep. But then we plotted on a 3D graph, we can see that there's a non-linear interaction. Humans are a tremendously interesting group to study, and if you want to improve people's lives, you need to study them. We just want to hopefully give you tools for making sure that when you study them, you're studying getting results that will actually be useful. So I'm open for questions now, please.
Thank you, Beth. So now the time for questions. So any, as still said, good or bad or stupid or intelligent question. Bhavita, you can come here so that you be slow in asking.
I'm sorry, can you speak a little slower, please? What is what? Yeah. So I'm sorry. So what's your scientific question? Why would you want to apply harmonics to students?
Why you need to calculate harmony?
Oh, why do you need to calculate harmonics? Harmonics, applying a sinusoid is one way people analyze circadian rhythms. They say, oh, there's a rhythm, and therefore I'm going to apply a sinusoid, and hopefully I've convinced you to applying a sinusoid with different harmonics is not necessarily the right way to do it, because not, even though it's got a 24-hour rhythm, it doesn't mean that it has a sinusoid of 24 hours. So, is that answer your question or not? I'm sorry.
The question is, she's asking about the good circadian software or software for the circadian analysis.
So it depends on your research question and it depends on what you're analyzing. So if you're analyzing dim-light melatonin onset, you need one set of software. If you're analyzing core body temperature, you need another. There are websites that have some of these online. I don't know if all of them have been tested. I know I tested one and it wasn't good. But when I send you my slides, I will list some of the websites that have software. The field of human circadian rhythms is trying to at least make sure that everybody does the calculations the same way on their different websites. And then the National Sleep Research Resource, sleepdata.org, will also be putting tools on their website. And when they're on their website, I trust that they're tools. Then there are other tools, as I said, where I don't know if they've been tested. So the first question is, what do you want to analyze? The second question is, why do you want to analyze it? And the third is, what tools do you then use? And those depend on your scientific question. And as I said, when I send the slides, it has a list of websites that can help you do the analyses for you, so you don't have to write the software code yourself.
Anybody else? Anyone you have a question, curiosity about to measure circadian rhythm?
Or, after I send you the slides, if you want to just email me later, and I would be happy to discuss about you.
You have the email ID, and you can write to her, and just put that you were a participant of this school, so that she will definitely respond to it. Because usually they get many more mails than they can probably read. So please do write that you are from this group.
Yes, please.
And so she can respond to your email and wait for a couple of days before you resend the same mail. Right? Because
I try to respond within 1 to 2 days, yes.
yeah. So any other question? Mr. Verma, do you want to thank her? Yeah. So
Thank you very much.
I'm asking Professor Verma to please be there, the host of this meeting, Professor Narsingh Verma, head of geology at this university. He's a medical scientist.
Thank you, madam, for giving this insight. I think your lecture was very complete.
Can you turn on your video? Yeah. We can see till. Yeah, now here we are. Yeah.
So, madam, I was saying that your lecture was complete eye-opener and how one can measure the things. I think you was able to create a lot of buzz, and new scientists will definitely go in that particular direction. And I have found that most of the time, the young chronobiologists or chronopersons, even medical scientists, they feel a lot of problem while in medical statistics, because they are not knowing that how to present their data and how the medical stats is different in this particular area.
It's a big problem. Teaching people how to do scientific and clinical work is not something that's taught in medical school. I totally agree. And for that, you need really good mentors. You need somebody to work with you to teach you how to do that. In the United States, they don't even necessarily teach about sequence circadian rhythms, let alone analysis or how to study them. And then the other issue is if you're in medical school and you want to learn how to do this, you don't learn how to do it. You need to work with somebody to learn how to do it. Yeah.
I would like to thank you again about your lecture. You have completed almost everything. And definitely you will get more and more questions by email.
I definitely hope so. I realize I spoke quickly and I had a huge amount of data. So I'm hoping when I send the slides, after I send the slides, more people will contact me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Beth, for agreeing to give a talk. I know it's morning time and you are almost on holiday. Enjoy away from the huge work in Boston. But, because you had promised the date, so I thought that I'll not let you go free. And if not offline, online, we will have it here in Lucknow. So thank you again from all of us, and we look for another opportunity for you to invite to India at your call. Let's hope that COVID does not return here. So far, so good. So we don't have COVID so far. We think we don't have it. Even if it is there, we don't care about it.
Well, I hope so. I hope to be there again. I really enjoyed the first time I was there, and I hope again.
Thank you so very much again. And so now, friends, we break for 10 minutes and we assemble here for the public talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
So we come here at